Hey everyone, hopefully we can get some people to join this live. I'm going to be talking today about the recent PFAS in water report from Consumer Reports with a research chemist that knows a lot more about it than I do. So I'm just going to wait for her till I see her on here and then we'll have her join. I collected some questions that people had submitted already, and it just seemed like they were pretty basic questions like what are PFAS, like do we need to be concerned about levels. So we'll go over sort of that basic info first, and then if anyone has any more detailed questions once we go over that, then we can get to those questions live here as well. So whenever we're talking, like just feel free to ask questions during it, and we'll hopefully get to them after we kind of just get through like basically what PFAS are. Do we need to be concerned about the levels that Consumer Reports found, and just other factors, like food, environment, where do we need to be concerned about the levels? If we do, what can we do about it? Just things like that. So I'm just going to check and see if she is on yet. Oh, here we go. Okay. Hi.
Hi,
Thank you
thanks
so
for
much
having
for,
me.
yeah, thanks for joining me today. This is a topic that I've been getting a ton of questions about, and I answer as much as I can, but it's not my area of expertise. So this is awesome that you messaged me, and I think this will be great because I've been getting, yeah, just since this Consumer Reports thing came out, I think it was like last September, people really didn't start like, I guess, posting about it until like a few months ago, and I've just been getting a ton of questions, and so this will be great. Yeah, thanks again for joining, and if you want to just start out and tell us who you are, like what you do, and then we can kind of get into what PFAS are and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Hi everyone. I'm really glad to be here. My name is KC Hyland. I'm a PhD research chemist, and I'm specifically an analytical chemist working in the fields of food and environmental testing. And I have a background in PFAS or PFAS research and testing and method development. And so I messaged the other day after the Consumer Reports post saying, hey, I have a few thoughts about this and I'd love to share some of them. Um, and yeah, like you were saying, like even before I think the Consumer Reports post, it's been sort of an upward trending topic for like years now. I think it started out, if you remember, like way back when there was a big New York Times article, the one that the Mark Ruffalo movie was about
yep,
last year.
yep,
That Mark
yeah,
Ruffalo movie came out about the chemical companies that were polluting the environment with these chemicals, and that was in
yep,
the 90s, and it's just been sort of like ballooning ever since then.
yeah,
And so a little bit about what PFAS or PFAS are. It's a kind of all-encompassing acronym that stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. And this is really a large class of compounds, of man-made compounds, that covers a pretty wide variety of different structures. So the structures in general are like a long carbon chain with a bunch of fluorines around them. And they come in different chain lengths, they come in different sizes, they come in different types of structures, and they come in different like structural functions. And so when we talk about PFAS, we're not really talking about one chemical. It's hundreds or actually even potentially thousands of different chemicals that all sort of have this similar skeletal structure. And the reason they're everywhere, the reason we even care about them right now, is because they're really unique. So this carbon fluorine bond is really special. It's one of the strongest bonds that exists in nature. It's like one of the strongest things that you can, one of the strongest ways you can stick two things together. And what that means is these molecules have really special properties. Most things you think of would be either soluble in water, like a salt, or soluble in oil, like a fat. But PFASs are not soluble in either. They resist both oil and water. And that sounds like kind of like, why do we care about that? But when you start to get down to it, a ton of applications actually use this. And some of the big ones are things like textiles, so anything that's like stain resistant. The big one that people know is like Teflon, so non-stick surfaces, but even stuff that people don't even think about, like Gore-Tex, so textiles that are like meant to be waterproofed, or like even food packaging materials, things that are intended to resist oil saturation, like pizza boxes or like paper wrappers for fast foods, sometimes have these chemicals treated in the surfaces because they have this really special property that's valuable, where it resists both oil and water.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great overview. Yeah, so I think if we want to just start talking, like we'll get into more of like food and environment stuff like that. But I think yeah, if we just want to get, I don't know if you had time to like actually look at the Consumer Reports article or anything like that. I know there's definitely questions as far as like methodology goes, and I just read it a little bit and noticed like they took like 2 to 4 samples of each product, so it's like a very small sample size. But let's just, I guess let's just pretend like those are, you can talk about the methodology if you want to, like if there are questions about it. But then, you know, like let's just say they are correct numbers. Like, do we need to be concerned about those levels? Because I think that's the biggest thing people want to know.
Yeah, this is a tough one. So, first of all, the numbers that I think we were, or the Consumer Reports were identifying as their target limit was around 1 ppt, which is 1 part per trillion, or 1 nanogram per liter. So, just to give you some perspective on that, the EPA guidelines, the EPA federal guidelines, is 70 parts per liter, or parts per trillion, nanograms per liter. So the regulations around these PFAS chemicals is a little bit unique because there is no real like federal government oversight that says this is the number, that's the limit. And we're talking specifically about drinking water right now. It's matrix specific. So like if we wanted to talk about food products or other things, it would be a totally different ball game. But for drinking water, the EPA says, you know, we don't have a hard legislative law in place, but we think the guideline is about 70 parts per trillion. And I think you mentioned this in your post too. Certain states are like, we're not super happy with that number. we're gonna regulate these values even a little bit lower for our state, for our state's drinking water, like municipal drinking water. And of course, bottled water companies have their own like quality control. But back to the number. So 1 parts per trillion, we're thinking about something that's really low comparatively to what the federal government or what the US EPA has designated as the safe limit. And if you want to look a little bit more globally, the EU drinking water limits are 10. So 10 ppt parts per trillion. So that 1 ppt number, while not like having a solid like black or white answer, like will this value or will this concentration harm you, it's quite low compared to like what's been studied as the tolerance limit for legislation or for the EPA guidelines.
Yeah, and I kind of read through that report, like trying to figure out where they came up with that, and it kind of just seemed like they were like, well, there's a bunch that are below it, so we think like if it's feasible, you should get it below that. But it wasn't necessarily like if it's above this, it's harmful. So I think, and it's tough too when you have like you have a federal guideline at like 70 ppt, and then there's other, you know, like bottled water companies that are setting it lower. So I think consumers are just wondering, you know, like
where do these numbers come from?
Yeah, like is that federal, you know, a lot of times the narrative is like, oh, the federal limit is trying to protect manufacturers, not like consumers. So I guess, do we know like what the level, I guess, should be in terms of like protecting consumer health? Like, is that 70 ppt a reasonable number? Should it be lower? Do we not know enough about them yet to really know that?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that I'm not a toxicologist,
Yeah.
but there is a really interesting kind of backstory to these compounds that's kind of unique compared to other like residues that we would think of in this lens. And that's that this unique structure, like I said, they're special molecules. They have really weird properties. And one of the things that's weird and special and valuable about them is that they're very inert. They do not react. And this is like a big deal for a lot of reasons that, like we could get into about like how they persist in the environment and stuff. But one of the things about that is for a long time, they were considered totally, totally safe. Like these are the most safest compounds we can make because they are completely non-reactive. They'll never break down. They'll never like turn into something toxic. They'll never like break down in your body, blah, blah, blah. So for a long time, it was just sort of this accepted paradigm that like, oh, they're totally non-reactive, so they're totally safe. And so they were in use for like various like government and industrial products for a long time before anybody even like started to consider any acute or chronic toxicological effects.
Right.
So that's sort of like the interesting backstory about them and why that's kind of like funky in the history of these compounds. But as far as like what is a reasonable number, I think that's a moving target. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say this, and the reason we kind of see this trend of all these different regional governing or regulating bodies starting to move towards lower and lower tolerance limits, is because the research is pretty new, especially when it comes to like long-term chronic exposure. When we think about, if we go back to that 1 PPT number, most of us here on this call, and this is not to like freak people out, most of us here on this call have a higher concentration than that in our blood right now. Mm-hmm. And it's just because these compounds are so ubiquitous. They're in so many products that we use and have used, and they don't ever break down, and they are inert, that they just kind of stay with us and hang out with us a lot. Mm-hmm. So most of us have higher than 1 PPT concentration of PFAS, total PFAS, in our blood right now. So,
right. Yeah. And that doesn't, I think sometimes too, that like might scare people too, but we have to also remember that like, just because we are detecting these things, it doesn't mean that it's actually causing harm. So,
yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think obviously we need to keep researching it. That's important. However, sometimes when you get like EWG or now Consumer Reports, like setting these levels
that are somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah. And it's like, if they would have gone by that lowest limit set by the bottled water companies, which was 10 PPT, none of what they tested would have been above that. They wouldn't have been able to get people to be as concerned about it. So, I mean, I get what, like, they're trying to get people concerned so that people, push, the government to do something about it, which I understand. But at the same time, that sort of turns into people being very worried about the water they're drinking. And they're like, I'm not going to buy this brand anymore. And so I think it's difficult because they do want to bring attention to it, which I think is valid. But at the same time, it's not only bringing attention to it, it's like it's scaring consumers over the things that they're consuming that aren't necessarily unsafe. So I just like, I want people to know too, just because they are detecting it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an unsafe level. So
that's a really great point. I'd love to touch on that for a quick second.
Yeah.
The words you used were just because we're detecting it doesn't mean it's an unsafe level. And we talked about how those like target levels are sort of a moving target. Mm-hmm. And this is also because if you think about it, in the last 10 years, our analytical technology has boomed. So the technology we use to detect these things now versus 10 years ago is miles and miles and miles away. We have so much better sensitivity, ability to look for these low levels, detection methods. As an analytical chemist, I've been involved in a lot of these, the development of these methods. So I can definitely speak to now versus 10 years ago is just absolutely night and day. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of like is a little bit self-perpetuating or like a vicious cycle, a little bit like, oh, now we can see lower. Now we can see lower. Now we can see lower. And just because we couldn't see it before doesn't mean that it wasn't there, or that it was safe or not safe, if that makes any sense. So there's kind of this like phenomenon in the industry or in the regulatory kind of landscape where we start to be able to see lower levels, and then people start to be concerned about those lower levels because we didn't see them before.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point too. So Yeah, I mean, just because we're detecting it, it's good that we can detect it, and so we can have better, more precise data. But again, that doesn't mean that it's cause for concern just because we are detecting it too. So,
That's right.
yeah. Somebody had a question. So because they're inert, are they able to ever be expelled from the body? So are they just like building up, or does it just take a longer time for them to pass through our bodies?
A little bit of both. So remember how I was saying that PFAS is a class full of a bunch of different compounds. So in particularly when it comes to size, so the length of that carbon chain has a lot to do with how much they stay in your body and where in your body they stay. So like for animals, most animals like us, when we accumulate organic compounds, they will stick in the fat tissue because they're hydrophobic. But we talked about PFAS being like really interesting and weird in that they repel both water and fat. So they kind of do this thing where they don't really accumulate in fat tissues like other contaminants do. And in fact, they end up kind of circulating in our blood more than like other potential like residues might do so. We also have research dating back over 10 years now that shows accumulation in breast milk, which was a major point of concern when looking at some of the chronic effects of this and some of the effects of this in development, in child development. But they are excreted. Excretion in urine is one of the major paths for excretion of these guys. But again, that's really dependent on the chain length. Oh, so I was saying us as animals will tend to excrete those smaller chains more readily than the longer chains. And this became a really interesting phenomenon that I was exploring. Actually, this is going back some years now, but when I was doing my graduate work, I was working on these compounds, and I was able to show a very different relationship for accumulation in plants. So animals will accumulate the longer chain PFASs preferentially and excrete the shorter chains, and plants will accumulate the shorter chains more preferentially.
Okay, interesting. I'm just gonna check to see what specific questions we have. Just a second. Uh, well, first, I guess first I want to talk about like, okay, so are they testing foods and bottled waters like regularly so we have data on these things? And then also as far as like tap water too, like how, because now, I mean, like these reports are coming out and it's like, okay, now that we, again, very, very like not very many data points from this Consumer Reports article, so I wouldn't be too concerned over it. But like people actually see that data now, and it's like, okay, but your water that's coming from your tap, at home, that could potentially be even more. So how is that? Is that regulated? Is that being tested regularly?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely. So this is actually a couple of different um, answers. So when we talk about food, that's regulated by a totally different body than drinking water. So
Mhm.
our drinking water is regulated for PFAS. We mentioned the EPA guidelines here in the US, which isn't technically a legislative regulation, but it is an EPA guideline that, has to be met, or the EPA can, raise fines or raise concerns.
Mhm.
Additionally, the EPA, as part of the Clean Water Act, Clean Drinking Water Act, every couple of years has a new list called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring List, or the UCMR list. And this is the EPA's opportunity to say, what new compounds should we be thinking about regulating? And so for the past, I think, 2 years, perfluorinated compounds have made it to the unregulated contaminant monitoring list, which means that here in the US, under the EPA guidelines, they'll be stringently monitored at like a selected distribution of multiple size watersheds and water treatment systems. And they'll be monitored for the next 2 years. And those data go into feeding and informing what the legislation will look like, or what the regulations will look like if they didn't exist before, or updating them if they did. So that's kind of where we're at with EPA guidelines here in the US for
Okay.
drinking water.
Okay. So like, should we be concerned about our drinking water, or like, do we know that it's not at a high level? Or yeah, I guess, like, what can the consumer, like, should they be concerned about drinking water? Should they,
I
you know
think
what I mean?
your everyday consumer, like most of us here on the call, don't really need to be concerned. Um, the EPA guidelines have been in place for 7 years now, almost 8 years now, I want to say. And in that time, there's definitely been a lot of focus and attention in the field on um, testing and updating water distribution, water treatment, and water distribution infrastructure with these things in mind. Now, the reason it's tricky is because these things are so weird. They're so persistent. They never break down,
Mhm.
um, and they're inert. So the typical water treatment technology that is in place and has been in place for 100 years doesn't really do anything to remove them. So it's really only been in the past like 20-ish years that these have been like in the field, in the eye,
Mhm.
um, to start implementing some more advanced treatment technologies. So it's a little bit tricky because it really does depend more so than other chemicals on what treatment technology is in place at the drinking water level, at the treatment and distribution level. And
Okay.
additionally, there are like certain locations in the US and certain populations in the US that are at higher risk.
Right.
So, for example, people with well water who rely on well water that is contaminated by military activities is
Mm.
actually like a really big deal. There are lots of cities, especially around the Midwest and the Mountain West, the Rocky Mountain regions, where there are Air Force bases. And what they do in these Air Force bases is they um, do fire training activities. So basically, they light a fire with jet fuel and they spray it. They practice putting it out.
Mhm.
And the spray that they use to put out jet fuel fires is AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, and that is made of perfluorinated surfactants. And because they use these at all of these bases around the country in really high volumes during these training activities, these compounds make their way into the groundwater where they don't break down. So
Mhm.
people in these like very specific regions around Air Force bases that rely on well water have been really like negatively impacted. Their water can get like really high concentrations and they can be in a place where they're unable to use their water, and that's like really scary.
Yeah.
Um, but most of us that are on municipal water systems, I'm here in San Francisco, so I'm on a city water system. Um, those like larger infrastructures are generally like have had PFAS on their radar for 20 years and have implemented technology and testing regimens that deal with that to be
Okay.
able to meet the 70 ppt guideline.
Right. Are they being used less now in specific things? I know, like, in Teflon, I don't think it's used anymore. So are they trying to, since it doesn't necessarily break down and we know that it's building up, are they, I know for sure in Teflon they are trying to use less of it. Is that
Yeah.
happening in other areas as well?
This is an awesome point, and I'm so glad you made it. So, like again, PFAS is a bunch of different chemical compounds, and for a long time there were two specific compounds that were like the poster children for
Hmm.
PFAS, and you've probably heard them. They're PFOA or PFOA and PFOS or PFOS, and
Hmm.
these are both 8 carbon chain lengths. One is a sulfonate and one's a carboxylate, but these were like the most widely used PFAS compounds. They were in everything. Again, like I said, the poster children. Um, and so when the EPA first started doing this research and digging into some of these like point source contaminations, the regulations or the guidelines, I should say, were only for PFOA and PFAS. And a lot of the like subsequent regulations and things, and even the first unregulated contaminant monitoring list, were just PFOA and PFAS. And it wasn't until like the past 10 or even fewer years that we started seeing, wait a minute, there's like way more other ones than PFOA and PFAS.
Hmm.
Um, and so coming back to your question, what happens in the industry is they realize, oh, people are really concerned about PFOA and PFAS. There's regulations about PFOA and PFAS. We're going to phase out PFOA and PFAS. And they do. They stop using it and most chemical manufacturers have stopped using it, but then they just replace it with like a different one. So they just like start to move towards a different chain length or
Yeah.
a different structural moiety. So they just make a different version of the compound. So one that's garnered a lot of scientific attention lately is called Gen X. That's the name of this compound. And it's just a different structure of polyfluorinated compound. And it was in the news 3 years ago or so, 2 years ago or so, because there was a big contamination event in Cape Fear, North Carolina, where a
Okay.
lot of the surface water systems were impacted by this Gen X compound. And people were like, what how could this happen? And it's because the industry started moving towards manufacturing this chemical, which wasn't on anybody's radar to be testing for.
Okay. Okay. So is it like, are they still just doing that, like just going to different ones, or are they trying to reduce all of them overall?
So part of the like intent, I think, or part of the like motivation towards moving to some of these different structures is trying to find ones that will be less harmful. For example, trying to
Okay.
identify different structures that might break down more easily
Hmm.
or be excreted more easily or not bioaccumulate as much. Um, the one example that I was talking about is the different chain lengths, right? We talked about how people will excrete the shorter chain lengths more readily than the longer chain lengths. So the
Hmm.
industry sees that those data and says, okay, well, maybe shorter chain lengths are a safer option. Let's phase out the longer chain lengths and move to making shorter chain lengths. So it's these types of decisions that really instruct or influence manufacturing trends and practices.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. As far as like food goes, you said it was used in like packaging materials. Do they also test regularly like food items for these chemicals too? And are there levels that we need to be concerned about in foods, or again, is it just like detecting it, but it's very low levels?
Yeah, foods and food packaging is harder because there are less the like guidelines around it are really ambiguous. So there
Okay.
aren't super clear um, regulations around like concentrations of certain food packaging materials. So like food contact materials or FCMs is how they're usually labeled.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not the like actual regulated values are super unclear. It's like here's a big long list of some chemicals that you might potentially someday use in food packaging, and you got to make sure that your food packaging doesn't exceed a certain percent by weight of any of them. So it's like
Okay.
really unclear, and if the list is intended to be like super all encompassing, so there's like stuff on there that doesn't make sense, and um so whether or not things get tested is really driven by how much they need to be tested, which is really driven by regulations. So like the more
Yep.
unclear the regulations are, the less I think motivated manufacturers are to be really diligent in that testing. So right
Okay.
now, a lot of food contact material testing is the onus of that or the burden of that testing is borne by the manufacturer versus something like drinking water, which is like really owned by um, regulating bodies. So it's
Okay.
kind of a murkier landscape when it comes to food and food packaging.
Okay. Would you say that like our exposure is probably the largest from water than it would be from foods? Just because since it is in the packaging, it's not necessarily like getting into the foods, whereas like water, it's in the, you're testing the actual water. So,
This is a bit of a $1 million question. I think it's that's a question that's like a hot topic right now, and I think the answer to it changes depending on who you are and where you live.
yeah, that's true.
So for the majority of us, yeah, I think it's been generally accepted for, like I said, the past 20 years or so, that our primary exposure comes from our drinking water. But depending on who you are, depending on your lifestyle, depending on where you live, that may or may not be true. So we also get exposure from things that are like indoors. Like we talked a little bit about textiles. So like there's research going back a few years now showing high concentrations found in like indoor dust samples. So
Hmm.
like say you're carpet is like stain resistant carpet or something, or even like certain foams that are in like chairs or cushions. Foams will be treated with this as like a flame retardant. So you might have these chemicals like in your house, in your indoor air, and they'll stick. They have sticky properties where they'll stick to things like particulate dust. So doing dust swabs and biomonitoring over the past few years has started to point to some other avenues of exposure besides drinking water. When it comes to food is kind of interesting too, because again, these things don't break down. So if they're in the water and then you use that water to irrigate crops, then they end up in the crops.
Right.
And we talked a little bit too about the different like chain lengths and the different species of PFAS, and some of them will bioaccumulate into plant tissues and then maybe end up like on your plate, versus some that won't, or that might end up in, for example, soil. So some will end up in the soil. All that being said, all these kinds of like pathways are things that happen, but we still have to bear in mind the amounts. So like, does that mean you're going to eat some lettuce and like get a big dose of PFAS? No, these are super teeny tiny amounts. It's like you have your PPT amounts that might be in your irrigation water, and then you'll have, you know, parts per trillion, parts per quadrillion in your plant matter. So I don't mean to be like, don't eat your plants.
Yeah, right.
That's not it. It's just kind of like when we want to think about like what are the most important routes of exposure for people and for the environment too, because we care about these chemicals like going into surface water where they might impact ecosystems, but also like remediation. What's the best way to clean them up? Where should we be looking for them in the future when we want to remediate them or clean them up or try and degrade them or something like that? So we have to kind of bear in mind all of these different avenues, where they end up in the water, where they end up in the soil, where they end up in the plant, where they end up in the person, and kind of try and identify what's the most important. And the other thing that I mentioned, like it kind of depends on who you are in your lifestyle and where you live, because these do bioaccumulate in animals. Like I was saying, all of us has, you know, a certain amount in our blood based on our lifetime of exposure. They tend to bioaccumulate in large marine animals. So populations that eat large marine animals. So there was a few studies looking at indigenous populations that eat like seal meat regularly.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Large aquatic mammals or large marine mammals do tend to have high concentrations of them. So if you're regularly eating seals or whales or sharks, you might have a high concentration in your body, or you might have accumulated a large concentration from that diet.
Okay. I'm gonna see. Sorry, I'm just gonna look and see if we have any questions. Let's see. Someone had a question about fluoride, which is kind of a separate question. Here, I'm just gonna put this one up there. I've heard that Teflon/nonstick coating can interfere with fertility in women. Is there data to support that claim? So I guess as far as like our exposures, like, you know, obviously I think the data and the research is continuing and ongoing. You know, I've read just a little bit about it, and like, I don't know, like do we need to be concerned based on the data that we currently have? You know, I have heard that it can potentially affect hormones in women. I mean, obviously that's going to be dose dependent as well, I'm assuming. And so is there data to show, I guess, like the amount that we are being exposed to actually having those negative consequences? Because I've seen a lot of, you know, like in vitro data and stuff like that, where, you know, it could potentially have those properties, but that's different from like, is that actually happening at the levels we're being exposed to?
Yeah, this is a great question. Again, I think a bit of $1 million question. So a couple of my first impressions here is, number one, we're only, number one, first of all, when it comes to PFAS, we're way more concerned about low dose chronic exposure than like any type of like acute exposure. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really not like acute toxicological effects we're looking for so much as these like long, non-lethal, long-term exposure effects,
Mm-hmm.
things like carcinogenicity or endocrine disruption. So those are the types of like effects that we are interested in seeing or interested in exploring. Um, and uh, given the amount of time that we've been really researching these compounds and our exposure to them, it's coming up on like the 20-ish year mark, right? 20 plus years now since the 90s, really, that we've like started aggressively exploring where are these chemicals in the environment, what are they doing in people, how are people being exposed to them. And so it's really only recently that we can start to answer those questions because now we're starting to see some of those exposures that have been happening for 20 plus years. Now, that being said, I don't think anyone needs to like throw out all their pans. Like, I don't think anyone needs to like freak out or throw out all their pans. I think that we're in a sweet spot right now where we're starting to get some of the answers. And like I said, when we first became aware of these chemicals or when the industry first started making them, it was just this like generally assumed thing that they were perfectly safe because they didn't react. But
Mm-hmm.
we know in recent years that, you know, exposure can have deleterious effects, including I don't know much about the fertility question, unfortunately, but some of the more interesting research that I've seen has suggested that it may be implicated in obesity, which is super interesting. If we think about that, like the reason being that long carbon fluorine chain that never ever ever breaks down looks in your body like a fatty acid.
Oh.
So it can bind to metabolic pathways that would be
Mm-hmm.
intended to break down fatty acids and then just never break down and just stay there forever, blocking
Huh.
your pathway for fatty acid metabolism. And that was just one sort of avenue that I thought was really interesting. Like, oh my gosh,
Mm-hmm.
what a weird thing to do. But
Yeah.
what a weird way for this like weird man-made chemical to behave in a body.
Right.
But as you know, there's been studies linking PFAS exposure to different cancers. I think kidney cancer is the big one because it gets filtered into your kidneys,
Mm-hmm.
um, as well as some uh, uh, developmental effects. And
Okay.
I think a lot of that was tied to, we mentioned their ability to bioaccumulate in breast milk.
Right. Okay. I'm just gonna
So I
check
don't know
and
if that was
see.
like a super black and white answer. I think the
Well,
answers, the
yeah, I mean,
research
I
is
think a
still
lot of this
happening.
is a gray area too, so it's
Hmm.
hard to say like yes or no on a lot of these things
It
too.
really is. And I know like at the end of the day, that's all people want to hear is like, this is safe and this
Right.
isn't. Do
Yeah,
this, not that. And it's just
yeah.
really hard.
Yeah.
Science doesn't really work that way. We can
Yeah.
only like make our best judgments or our best assessments with what we know at the time, and what we know is
Right.
always changing.
Yeah. Okay, I think there was a question. Can here let me, can PFAS in indoor dust be absorbed via inhalation dermal pathways?
Yeah, definitely. So inhalation is a big one. So there was a study a few years ago, it might still be going on, it started a few years ago, where they were looking at swabs of children's hands. So like toddlers especially, they touch things and they put it in their mouth. And so this was a way that they really wanted to measure how people or very young children were being exposed, how much PFAS young children were being exposed to because they touch things and put it in their mouth and they're like low to the floor where there might be a dust.
Mm,
And that was sort of, you know, hypothetically like maybe a worst case scenario for exposure for indoor contaminants is like young people touching their mouth and being
right.
around on the floor and crawling around on the floor. So yeah, so that's definitely a route of exposure that's being researched and potentially relevant.
Okay. Let me see if there's any more. So some people like you can ask questions like in the comments. I don't know. I might have missed some of the questions in the comments. I'm just gonna
Let
go
me
through to
see. I wasn't
see
really looking, but I
because
can
there's
look.
this like little question thing, and there's a few that we already covered, so I'm not gonna go through those again. yeah, that was just like about tap water, which we kind of covered. And then Teflon we've covered. I guess as far as like advice, wait, let me see. Are there testing? Oh, I think we went over that already. So just as far as like, are there things that we can do to reduce our exposure, or things that we should be doing, or, are we just being exposed at really low amounts that we don't need to be concerned about? You had mentioned like the flame retardant stuff, like should we be avoiding that kind of thing, or is that still like a low exposure? Yeah, I guess if there's just any
This
advice,
is
like
a
as far
tough
as
one. Yeah, because a lot of us are sort of at the mercy of, what materials we have given
right,
to us that would be our exposure venue, like our drinking water. Like we're at the mercy of the drinking water. When it
right,
comes to like the difference between tap water and bottled water, I I don't think there would be. Your tap water is probably safer if you live in a metropolitan area.
okay,
Of course, there are these special cases I mentioned where like some people might be impacted by like very concentrated point source contamination, like the Air Force bases is one example,
hmm
or those folks down in Alabama, I want to say, or was it Arkansas? Wherever the chemical plant was back in the 90s that had a major chemical spill. There was a textile plant and there was a bunch of discharge in the
okay,
water there. So that was like a point source location where like a small community was impacted. Same thing with like the Cape Fear community being impacted by that one point source
hmm
of water. But in general, like your tap water is going to be tested diligently to comply with EPA guidelines. I lost you for a
hmm
second, and that's usually
yep,
a pretty safe bet. Um,
okay,
as far as the other things, like the other routes of exposure, like there's not a whole lot you can do about it. You don't really know like what's in your
right,
indoor dust, you know what I mean? And or what's in, even
yeah,
if you're like in a public place and you sit in a cushy chair, or what's in the foam in that cushion, or
hmm
um, what products have PFAS that are legacy in them versus newer products that might have phased it out or phased it out and
right,
gone to another structure. So it's hard for a regular consumer to even know, to be able to make those choices. And until
right.
there's federal oversight that says, here are the rules, this is what needs to be on a label, this is what you're allowed to put in there, no company is going to advertise that information.
Right. Yeah. Let me just look here. Oh, I don't think that was a question. Um, hold on a second. I don't think there's any questions that we haven't covered. If anybody has anything, um, yeah, you had talked about the Cape Fear water.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody asked in cleaning supplies, would it be an issue in cleaning supplies?
Oh yeah, it totally can be. The I, the funny so this is a funny story anecdote. So funny story. When we are studying these compounds in the lab, usually if you're studying something that's toxic, like a pesticide or a residue, if you're measuring a toxic material, you wear gloves to protect yourself, right? You don't want that stuff touching you in any way. When we study PFAS, we wear gloves to protect the sample because there's more PFAS on me and like in my blood than the
hmm
amount that I want to measure in the sample. And so something that's happened before is I was in a lab uh, where we couldn't get the background level of the PFAS down. For some reason, the instrument was always showing these really high levels all the time, all the time. Anyway, long story short, the cleaning company had switched to like a different floor wax or something, and the floor wax had this chemical in it, and so it was kind of everywhere in the lab, and you just like the machine would always detect it.
Oh my
Another similar story
God.
is there was this one girl in another lab that I worked in, and her levels were always high. Everybody else had like normal levels, and her levels were always weirdly high. Long story short, she was a competitive snowboarder, and she was covered basically in snowboard wax all the time.
Oh my
And the
gosh.
snowboard wax utilized these compounds as
Yeah.
a repellent. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's really dependent on, oh, my dog's going to be in the background. It's really dependent on like what you're exposed to, what your lifestyle choices are, and yeah,
Okay.
it's hard for a consumer to know. Like she would
Yeah.
have never thought that that was in her snowboard wax.
Right. That's crazy. Um, Somebody was asking about meat, but I don't know what they meant by that. Heavily seared meats. I don't know if that would have anything to do with PFAS.
It is a project that's been I've targeted in my to-do list for the next year to look at PFAS levels in more like non-produce, non-fruit and vegetable matrices.
Okay.
So looking for PFAS in like dairy,
Okay.
and fish, and probably meat at some point too is
Okay.
something that we're interested in looking at.
Okay. Let me see here. Not sure if I understand. Would you recommend people? Oh, this is okay. So, would you recommend people at Cape Fear drinking bottled water instead?
I First of all, probably not. So the Cape Fear water that was impacted was like environmental surface water. I don't know if that water body is used for any municipal drinking water, so it may not be. And even if it is, like they're aware of that problem. Millions of dollars went into the remediation of that site. It was a big deal in like, I want to say 2017 or 2018 when that happened. But it was in a way like a mixed blessing, because after that happened, the state of North Carolina dumped a ton of resources into research, remediation, method development. They funded a whole like Institute for PFAS research down at Duke University. Well, it was actually among several universities, but a bunch of these research projects were happening at Duke, UNC Wilmington. So it was kind of, like I said, a mixed blessing, because in response to this event, it actually spurned a lot of resource and funding and stuff for that work.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, it just seems like it's something we are figuring out. And would you say that, I guess, like, even from 10 years ago, like we obviously understand more, like, is it being regulated more than, because I think a lot of
Absolutely.
times people think too, like, it's getting worse, but in reality, like if we're understanding it more and it's being regulated more, it's actually better than it was, 10,
Yeah, and
20 years ago.
I totally get why people think that, because as we understand it better, or as we can measure it better, or these types of things, we might hear more about it, or we might see
Right.
more about it. And so it's natural to think like, I didn't hear about this 10 years ago, it must be getting worse. But no,
Hmm.
I think that the opposite is true. Like you said, as we are able to measure them better, able to measure them at lower levels, able to like get some of this long-term data over so many years, and able to, influence regulatory bodies to
Hmm.
make meaningful changes and make meaningful legislation, I do think it's getting better. Now versus 10 years ago, we have so much less to worry about. The drinking water is actually being tested routinely, which wasn't the
Hmm.
case 10 years ago. Newer drinking water infrastructure, and treatment processes are designed with these compounds in mind, which they didn't used to be.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just something that people know about now. If you were running a wastewater or a drinking water treatment plant 20, 30 years ago, you've never heard the word PFAS. And now
Hmm.
everyone knows that this is something to be looking out for and to be concerned about, and that
Right.
they need to comply with regulations in order to keep their watershed safe.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's just something like people need to keep in mind too when you see these things from, I don't know if the EWG specifically has, I know they have like that was one thing I wanted to ask you about too. So I do get people asking me a lot, like, should I be looking at the EWG, like water? I don't know exactly what they do, if they're doing their own testing or what they're doing. But I
Yeah,
know
they come
sometimes
up with their
people,
own values, right?
yeah. So are they just setting, again, like arbitrary numbers that don't necessarily mean that if they're over, it's unsafe?
Yeah,
I
that's
didn't
my
know how that worked.
impression.
Okay.
That's my impression when I've seen them for like food testing samples and environmental testing samples like drinking water. My
Mm-hmm.
impression is that they pull data from other sources. Like I don't know if they collect their own data or not. But they set it against a limit that they have determined. And that limit
Yeah.
seems somewhat arbitrary to me. Now, it could sort of be said that a lot of regulatory limits are arbitrary to some point, since,
Yeah.
in an ideal world, they would all be based on toxicological data, and that just doesn't always exist.
Right.
Um, but
But I
yeah,
think
yeah.
like as far as like what I know, like as far as food and like what they do with the Dirty Dozen and all the glyphosate stuff that they've done too, like
Hmm.
they take already very conservatively set safety levels and they're just
And they'll
like,
like
we're
apply a
gonna divide
safety
this by
factor.
10.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
like, why? And you can't
Yeah.
find any reason why they did that. So I think I think I think obviously, if they're not even collecting their own data, like that data already exists. So it's not like they're even like collecting data. But, I don't think necessarily we want to be collecting data. I think the issue comes when you have organizations like that. And kind of like I said before, like I understand why they're doing it. They want to get, they want to get attention to it. And it could be a valid issue that they want attention for.
Hmm.
However, they're doing it in a way that also scares consumers over things that aren't necessarily unsafe. So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I think just like being aware of anytime you see like a headline and, it's just being shared everywhere and
Like,
it's like,
where did that come from? Yeah.
yeah, just like like don't just all of a sudden throw away all of your whatever water was the highest one, I can't remember, but a lot of people are like, I'm throwing this away and I'm never buying this again. And I think it's like just stop for a second and like kind of wait for other sources to kind of come in and maybe like put it into perspective more because that that like very sensationalized information like just goes so far too and you just have people posting about it everywhere that don't really they read the headline. And I mean the other thing too is like when you actually do read full some of the full articles, even though like the headline might seem really scary, like sometimes I'll read an entire article and I'm like, oh, that was actually pretty balanced, like, but most
Hmm.
people are just reading the headline and it's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I need to throw all my water away. But
Yeah. I think that's a
yeah, I
problem in
mean,
every field, but
yeah, definitely.
PFAS
Yeah.
have definitely gotten a bad rap in the media, or I guess a lot of media attention. And the one that I see, the headline that I see all the time, and I guarantee you search this in Google, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of hits, is the forever chemicals. You've probably
Yes.
seen this. This is
Yeah.
like the media name for them, the forever chemicals, which I get,
Yeah.
like they have earned this. They've
Yeah.
earned this name. They are forever chemicals. That's what they do. But I kind of chuckle a little bit at the way like that terminology or that phrase has been like grasped
Yeah.
onto as a way to like clickbait, so like you get people to
Right.
like pay attention, which
Yeah.
again, like they are forever chemicals. It's super crappy that they stay in the environment forever and they bioaccumulate in polar bears.
Right.
They're so ubiquitous that
Yeah.
they survive transport across the atmosphere, across the ocean, in fish, in water, in air, to be bioaccumulating in polar bears that have never worn a Gore-Tex jacket or cooked with Teflon. So
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
kind of crazy that they have these weird properties and are so persistent. And I think it's right that our scientific community and regulatory bodies are concerned and putting funding and research into it and making the public aware. Because, buying power is the ultimate driver for what gets manufactured and what gets sold. So I
Hmm.
think all those things are ultimately good. But yeah, anybody that like reads something and gets scared of it, maybe like take a second look. Like,
Yeah.
where did this come from? Is there other research? Who's giving me this number? Who wants to make me afraid of it?
Yeah. And even like I think even Consumer Reports like in their article they even like outlined the levels that have been set by the government
Mm-hmm.
and then they were just sort of like we decided to do 1 part per trillion and it was kind of like okay, so
Yeah.
I mean
And with no like real reason for doing that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean they might say something like there are some leading scientists that think that we should make it this number. And so it like makes it sound a little bit more official. But
Hmm.
I think even if you like read the articles from the actual like sources that are like kind of doing some of the fear mongering too, like they'll even put some of that in there where, you know, it's kind of like, oh, okay, where are they getting that lower number from? Like, does that make
Hmm.
sense? And so, and I think a lot of times too, they're coming from the perspective of like, well, we tested a bunch and like the majority were under 1 part per trillion. So like if it's possible, we think you should do it, which could be legitimate, but at the same time doesn't mean that if it's over, it's unsafe. So
Yes, I have a
yeah.
lot of feelings on this topic. As an analytical chemist, I see those things sometimes and get a little cringy because what will happen is um, we'll report a method has a certain limit of quantitation or limit of detection, and that
Mhm.
limit might be, let's just say it's 1 ppt, for example. I think most methods for PFAS are lower than that, but for state of example,
Yeah.
let's say we determined that our analytical method is accurate and precise down to 1 ppt. It's super easy for someone else to snag that number and say, that's the limit now. It has to be 1
Right.
ppt or lower. And that's not
Yeah.
how it works. It's just,
Yeah.
that's the lowest that you can measure, has
Right.
nothing to do with safety. And it means
Yep.
that you can't get a real number for anything below it. That's just the limit of what you can see or what you can measure.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I think sometimes when those values get reported, they get twisted around in that way too.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. And even, yeah, that's a good point too, because sometimes like you will see like I think when EWG came out with like their glyphosate, some of their readings I was like, that's so low. I think like the methodology they're using wouldn't even be able to like it would be within
I
like
know
the error
exactly what you
of
talk
the
about.
what
Yep.
yeah, and so that's that's a good point that they might be potentially looking at that somewhere and being like, oh, one part per trillion, okay, when it's that's really not what it should be for the limit. It's just saying like we can't measure anything less than that. Yeah,
That's right.
that's a good point. I'm just gonna see if we have. I don't. Well, actually, I think this cuts off after an hour, so we should probably. I don't want it to just like randomly cut off. So,
All right. Well, we can wrap it up, but I really appreciate you
yeah,
having me.
yeah. Thanks so much. If you have any last like summary or last things you want to say,
I would say, like, I'm really glad that people are becoming more aware of PFAS and what they are. But nobody freak out.
yeah.
Be
I think
aware,
that's the
do
biggest
some
thing. Like,
reading,
don't
just
read
don't freak
headlines
out.
and freak out about it. There are some legitimate things we should be uh not worried about, but just cognizant about. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of times people think too, like these aren't being tested. We don't know what's going on, but like we know this information because they are being tested. And
Because of
like,
testing. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, exactly. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And
Yeah, it was
I
fun.
really appreciate it. It was some great info. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.